All right, class. Today we're going to talk about understanding buyers. As the slide says, along with the learning of the sales process, you need to understand business buyers as well. And I'm sorry, there is some construction going on next door if you hear noise. So, there are different categories of buyers. You have consumers like you and I that are going out and purchasing, and then you have business markets, which can be broken down into three more categories. The focus of this course is going to be on the B2B market or the business market, and specifically on firms. So firms are going to be what you think of as a typical corporate organization. And then government, kind of self-implied, whether that's, your city government, your state, county, national, but that's going to be another category. And the last category is institutions. And so with institutions, UCO would fall under this category, as would, from the picture, hospitals, etc. And we will focus solely on firms. Why we do that is because governments and institutions buy differently than firms. There's a lot more process to go through with both governments and institutions in order to make a sale. There's more of a process in place that has to be followed in terms of almost paperwork or people signing off, where, let's say, if I'm getting reimbursed for something, like 5 or 6 people have to sign off on it, even if it's $10. Where at a firm, that would happen a lot easier. So generally, if you're in a company that specializes, that has different groups of business markets, then you'll have someone that's a salesperson that specializes in institutions or government that, has been trained on how they buy. Because it's not that what we're doing doesn't apply, there are just some other kind of red tape that you have to go through, if that makes sense. All right, so some things that distinguish business markets maybe from consumer markets. Derived demand, which means that demand is derived from the consumer markets. So what consumers want helps or does derive what companies are producing or if they're growing. So even thinking about maybe COVID, the need to have additional resources or additional nurses or doctors or space, etc., because of what's happening in the consumer market. That also causes more fluctuation in demands. You're dealing with purchasing professionals. So a lot of times you're going to have a purchasing department that you're also going to have to work with when selling to a firm. So people that are really there to review contracts and go through the nitty gritty and make sure, not that they necessarily care about the product or service you're selling as much as they do about the purchase, the contract, how it fits in budget, those types of things. That goes straight into multiple buying influences, and we'll talk in a minute about buying centers. But multiple buying influences is that it's generally not one single person that makes the decision. They may be the final decision maker, but you have influences from whether it's purchasing, whether it's, finance, accounting. There are multiple buying influences. Also, as we've talked about with relationship selling, you're going to have closer relationships. Generally when I go to Best Buy, even if maybe I'm buying a computer, I generally don't really build a relationship with the person I'm, buying a computer from. That's a lot different in a business market. You do have those closer relationships where you may work together for years and years. So there's a few different types of buying situations in general, or selling buying situations. Um, so on one side of the spectrum, you have something that's very routine. It's called a straight rebuy. What a straight rebuy is that you're not making any changes. You're just purchasing the same thing over again. With a modified rebuy, there's going to be something different in terms of who you're selling to. So either it's that the firm or the buyer is not familiar with your company, or they're not familiar with buying a particular product or service that you're selling. So if they're not familiar with your company, so for instance, let's say it's payroll software, maybe they've worked with ADP always in the past, and you work for Paycom. So that would be a modified rebuy because they've purchased payroll software before, but they have never worked with you. And a new task is going to be that they're not familiar with your company, they're not familiar with what they're purchasing. And so you're going to see different levels of risk, risk information search associated with each one. So if it's a straight rebuy, low risk, low looking for alternatives information search, and then it kind of switches to moderate and high, as you might imagine, as you move towards new task. So with the buying center concept, it's important to know that buyers are driven by multiple goals, and those are personal goals, and then there's company goals or organizational goals. So with personal goals, you can read here, it relates to the person themselves. Are they going to keep their job? Is it going to help them rise in the ranks? Is it going to make them happy or make their job easier? Where the organizational goals are going to deal more with the company itself. And so we can build value with our products or services at both levels of goals. So the last thing I'm going to talk about before, kind of ending with this video is the concept of the buying center. So earlier I mentioned that with business markets, there are multiple buying influences. And so this is a representation of those multiple buying influences. So you have different people, and people can play more than one of these roles. So for example, you have the initiator, and that's the person that actually initiates the purchase decision. So maybe contacts you or you contact them first. The decider is going to be the final decision maker. Final decision maker. Influencer is someone that has any level of influence over the purchase decision or purchase decision process. So going back to those purchasing professionals, they would be a great example of an influencer. Or maybe if you're the CFO and you have analysts under you and you're buying some kind of software, your analysts may not be the final decision makers, but they would be influencers and maybe users. And users would actually use the product or service. And then the gatekeeper, I often associate with like an administrative assistant. It's anyone that's going to control the flow of information. So stop you from getting an appointment, talking to the person you need to, etc. And like I said, you could have someone that initiates the decision is, or the purchase, is the final decision maker and is also going to use the product or service. So these aren't standalone roles necessarily. So I'm going to stop here and then we will continue with kind of the purchase decision process.